Chapter 2. When I awoke from patchy sleep and spiteful nightmares, I momentarily forgot my own dark dread. Joe was asleep next to me and I could hear the helpers tidying around the house, especially the debris of the party. It was in a kind of hazy stupor that my mind raced back. I thought of her, the girl, of my real nightmares, of Z. Had I paid attention previously to Z? I tried to rack my brains. She'd been hired through the usual channels and always got high security clearance. Helpers were adept at blending into the background. They needed to keep their jobs. Not until Z approached me do I remember her, and yet she was the most stunning looking helper I'd ever seen. I couldn't even recollect Joe causing a fuss. It was possible we weren't even speaking, but then things had eventually gone right. With the usual patch-up came a unique pregnancy, except things went wrong too. Work had been busy. There was the constant checking of details, the interviews, the appearances in the sub-courts where the subs and helpers were tried, or the chambers. I hated seeing an upper go down, and I hated it when a child was taken to the white rooms. Sometimes it all seemed so unnecessary, but of course it was not. I remembered Z. She'd tricked me, caught me just right, but it was the electronic note that clinched it, the note with its code, unmistakable. I couldn't ignore her connection. She also had the most beautiful smile. I suppose I kind of fell for her. A helper, a sub. What was I thinking? But she had the message and the code. That meant someone from my department was involved. Her story could have been true. Must have been true. For the most part, was true. Jo had been 6 weeks pregnant when Z came to me. "Mr. Adams, sir?" It is their way of addressing us. "Yes?" I was irritated. I'd had to bring work home with me. I was lucky to be working in communion still, as the expression goes. Lucky to get out of the apartment block. But I had to bring work home many evenings. It was this that sparked off one of the nastiest rows with Jo. But you should have known how privileged we were, even for uppers. "May I talk with you, sir?" "Go ahead." "In strictest confidence, sir." Then I noticed her eyes and the shape of her body. This was how she had become a helper, I considered cynically. With curiosity I answered, "Very well." She sat down facing me behind my desk. Her eyes were impassive, softly beautiful, but she was not totally sure of herself. I got up, looked outside the office and shut the door. "We're alone. Speak." "I have this," handing me the e-message. It had the code. Only those working in my department had access to it. I read the screen carefully. Now that I look back, I can see how clever it all was. But they played a chance, and yet it was only the girl that played and took a real chance. To begin with, at least. I could have had her dismissed on the spot, even killed, vaporized, or worse, sent to surgery. They hated the surgery. It was deeply secret, but it happened. But Maya's then mysterious comrade and this beautiful girl must have seen the opportunity. There was a look of her, a kind of fierceness subdued by self-discipline. There was my baby growing in my wife's womb. The code. Lucky timing? But I wasn't a pushover. There was too much at stake. I did not turn her in. The code prevented that. I said, "You know what would happen if I reported this?" She said nothing, but parted her lips slightly. The room was close. On the screen was the file of another young woman, caught with an upper and with an unborn child, ready for the white rooms. "You've taken a risk?" It was an understated remark. Still she said nothing. "Wait," I said firmly. I at least understood her predicament. They knew that. Someone in my department had messed things up. Sure, they saw their chance. That night I could not sleep. There was much to consider. Jo lay peacefully. Things between us were almost perfect. Perfect. The word entered my mind to taunt me. But we were in harmony again. She had even accepted credit from her father to help me out. Sure, I got a big wage, but Jo could spend and I gambled with shares. Share shuffling was the only real dangerous thing I did anymore. Until then. Share shuffling was the way my reckless nature could express itself. I didn't do helpers. I told you, I hardly noticed them, until Z came along, and Z was especially beautiful. I suppose I fell in love with her as I had once with Jo. That was reckless enough. The thing was, I hadn't been getting too many lucky deals, and I'd had to cash in my shop policy. It was no big deal. I couldn't get insurance. I wasn't that high up. To be truthful, I hadn't wanted that extra expense. But I could always get enough for a shot, I thought. And I admit, credit got tighter when Jo and I fought. She would take it out on me by buying things, anything. She was a Legionnaire's daughter. She wasn't going to work, but she wasn't necessarily going to put up with me and my demands. So her getting the credit from her old man was a godsend. It made life easier for me. I got my job in records because of him. That was what Jo always maintained. So taking work home also meant I could get credit for my shots. Did the message sender know that also? He must have. No point otherwise. No point pounding a bloodless stone, eh? That's why I could have killed him with my bare hands, because he had killed me in a sense, or at least begun to. And he knew, was prepared to betray me. There had been a serious breach of security for sure. Something made me decide to trust her. Something made me want to help her, to take a risk, a real reckless risk. Something made me prepared to step outside the laws. And I'd never actually been to subearth. Sure, I'd seen pictures and flicks, but I'd never been down. I hated the thought of white bodying. People were using the illegal fighting as a cover to procure sex subs. I knew the results of all that. And there was the supposed trade in limbs. People said these limbs came from the fighters, but I'd seen limbs that had belonged to women and children. Except we all forgot. We saw and we forgot, because we only remembered what was official and allowed. I made an excuse to Jo about working late at the office. Only a worker in communion could do that. My grandfather had done much the same so many years ago, so our family history told, and he had been a wild man. Jo took it, and I was sorry then. Not as sorry as I was to become. We fought a lot, but I loved her. Still love her more than ever. The helper just looked so sexy and beautiful. It was as if I wasn't sure of how Jo and I would be. I wanted to be next to Z, that was all. I never did sleep with her. I never did do her, to use the crude expression. Z with her slender, pale limbs, perfect curves, hair cut short, dark eyes and her lips a deep, healthy red. At work I tried to fathom who had been transgressing. Nobody lost their cool, and so it was that on a Mercredi night I met with Z and we drove towards the border. With the car and my rank we crossed without fuss. It didn't seem surprising to the guards. I remembered their particular border control for future reference. They had wry smiles stuck on their faces. Once across the border, the advert stopped. There were shacks of sorts that soon petered out into rough countryside. The moon lit things up. She didn't speak. She was going back for the first time for a couple of months. She missed her child, her boy. She felt the tension, so she admitted later. We drove for some time before her town rose upon a hill in the distance. We couldn't drive in. She knew where to stop. I had to change into the gear she had brought along. There was only me. It was dangerous, and for the first time I felt apprehensive. I was doing something just for the thrill of it. I had nothing to gain but the kick. Not all the subs had the disease, of course. The helpers were screened. There was never any trouble from them because their main hope of avoiding infection came from being out of and away from the squalid subearth towns. But even some of the older subs had stayed healthy. We walked the last 5 lengths into the town. The long huts came into view as clouds scudded over the moon face. I'd seen these things on the screen, but only from a distance. I pulled myself up. "You want to take a look in?" Z broke her silence, kept from when we had abandoned the car. Her voice sounded different. Why shouldn't it have? Our relationship wasn't quite the same. "It wouldn't be pretty," she continued. "Maybe too much. Long huts are the sepulchres of a strange religion." "What?" "You wouldn't want to look in." "No, I want to see." She gave me a quizzical look. I'm still not sure if she really expected me to go with her. A warder sat outside. He paid scant attention to us. There was no reason to. We weren't going to buy. He assumed we were both subs. Apparently relatives sometimes came to visit, might arrive on a windy, moonlit, Mercredi night. The huts were lit only by stoves. The stoves gave their shadowy light and heat. More importantly, these stoves stuffed the air with thick smoke, which hid its otherwise acrid stench. How did I know? Close up to the bodies, you could smell their perfume. "They should let them die," Z said without emotion. though I thought I detected some hidden feeling beneath her words. I looked at the rows of beds and the naked, chalk-white bodies laid on top. Tubes supplied the mixture which thinned the blood enough to keep it moving. Each had an implant to drive the heart. Waste products were filtered through tubes that disappeared into holes in the hut's walls. Walking along and sometimes in between the beds, I stopped occasionally to look at the eyes of the bodies. They seemed to stare motionless, but I thought I caught a flicker from a male body, once young and healthy. "No chance," said the water later. "What happens to them?" I asked. "These die," he said dryly. "These die eventually. Go to a better place, eh?" he said with a twinkle in his otherwise dead eyes. "What happens to them then?" He quizzed me, shrugged his shoulders, but we both knew the answer. Of course I knew the answer. Faced with this reality, even I could not forget, could not lie to myself. Before I left, I looked back. There was no sound from them, just the eyes staring into the metallic rafters of the ceiling. Just the smell of the stove's fires burning and a kind of rotting odour smelt occasionally. The bodies lay as if dead, but they were alive, and I couldn't imagine how a society could tolerate them being so. And at the back of my mind I registered their full-limbed bodies, their almost unnaturally smooth skin. I told Z about how I felt. She thought me sentimental. She went to say something else but stopped herself. Then she said, "Have you ever seen a deformed upper?" I had to think. It was something I had never been forced to consider. No, I had not seen deformed uppers because our surgery was so good. That is how we could lie to ourselves. I felt ashamed but repeated, "No." She laughed. "Why are you laughing?" Until then I had deliberately not connected the lack of deformities in upper with the supposed trade in limbs, the supposed surgery, the supposed transplants. Even thinking the word supposed caused me to squirm. She said nothing and laughed again. "You think we have no ethics?" she said eventually. I could only look. There was too much to consider, to re-evaluate. "These are the lucky ones, the special ones," her eyes glinted. "We let them die in their own time before." But she stopped again. I could not meet her stare. "Did you know that some of these young subs, with their pure skin and pure features," she looked directly at me, "come by themselves to the long huts, or led by a warder with a smile on his face?" I shook my head. There was much I genuinely did not know. "You think we have no morals? But we subs think the long huts are a place to escape." She laughed. We believe the subs in the huts are in limbo. And they are. And she laughed loudly as she said, "Limbo." But the huts at least prepared me, however slightly, for what I was to see in the town. Even at night, subs were about. Subs with limbs missing, subs with gaping wounds that marked their skins as if grotesque crustaceans had attached. Subs with eyes and ears missing, and subs as crazy, as possessed, as perverted as anything I'd ever seen on the flicks. The unlucky ones. "The disease?" I kind of asked, helplessly. "Never seen it up close?" I said nothing. The bodies in the huts, they were all perfect. We had never seen anything like that on the flicks. "What happens to them?" I asked tentatively, gazing at the hapless subs. "You mean you don't know?" "I think I know," I replied shakily. As I spoke, I also acknowledged the perfection of Z's form. It was she who was the aberration, and I also realized a complete shift in our relationship. Only then did I have the great desire to kiss her. "You uppers," she began, "you think you know everything. At least you have everything. At least you have shots." My shots would be due shortly. How could I have gambled so much? Even with those figures to haunt me, I had taken the ultimate risk. She continued, "You have no idea what it is to live day to day, unsure if you will contract the disease, if the numbness will come, when the brain will start muddling things up. You have no idea what it is to see your mother and father stumbling about, spilling boiling water over their flesh, cutting their fingers accidentally. What it is to hear them ask you who you are. You cannot imagine. I am blessed, Mr. Adam, and so are those bodies you saw lying in the huts. They escaped the real pain. Sure, they've suffered. Suffer. This disease is hell, simple, but they have their limbs intact, and for them, no fighting, no illegal chopping." "What do you mean exactly?" I began to say, but at that moment something happened to cut my speech. Now as I recall what took place, I can see the scene in full. There were tumbled-down houses filling every narrow, dirty street, fires burning in chimneys and smoke clinging about rooftops. The moon was choked hidden. Though dark, children raced around, some hobbling. There were fights in alehouses, grog houses, braziers burnt rubbish on street corners. Women with 4 limbs intact made money from those desperate to feel one last sensation run through their flesh. But this part of town was where the healthy stayed away, if they could. Even in subearth, there was separation. As I asked for more details about the disease, a man rushed up to us, though his gait seemed to throw him forward as if he were out of control. In his hand he carried a long blade. "It's the devil!" he cried. "Lord Satan is here! Mockasy! The Dark One!" And as I turned my head, the blade swept past my face. I could feel its dirty breeze whip across my skin. The man stumbled to the ground. "It's the angel!" he spat. "Listen!" he shouted. "You'll have to shut him up," Z shouted. Other bodies were coming from the shadows. "He's here! The unclean one! He's a come!" The man dribbled dirty saliva from his mouth, lifted himself slowly. Bodies had come close. "Do something quick," Z urged. I stamped on the man's hand left holding the ground. He groaned. Swiftly I let a kick crack into his face. For a moment he registered no pain. Only his lips bloomed bloodless. Another kick sent him back down to the ground. The bodies around us, a mess of rags and uneven limbs, quavered briefly. "What now?" I said between gasps for breath. Z shouted, "Run."